Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We have the pleasure of having a fireside chat together, Tommy and myself. And the fireside chat is about a topic which I think a lot of people have some type of idea about, but maybe not all of the ideas. We're talking about carbon credits. Before we go into the topic, Tommy, maybe you can give us a quick recap of your journey from politics to banking to actually becoming an entrepreneur in the carbon markets.
Thank you for having me, Sebastian, and great to be here. So it was a journey of just trying to figure out how the world works for the first 10 years. I started working for the Green Party in the European Parliament, actually the German Greens, and then spent 5 years doing political consultancy, just trying to figure out how decisions are made in government, and then was lucky to get a window into a sell-side research, where actually I started being a macro strategist, so looking at kind of markets and risk-taking. And I think the key thing for me was I was doing a lot of work on trends for the 2020s and doing a lot of work in what's called fund flows, so big macro flow of funds research. And what was clear was there was this tidal wave of ESG money, which is still sort of trying to express itself as today's conference in 2019, but was absolutely raw in its ability to actually do anything. And sitting behind that, there was absolutely no industry, really. If you're thinking that there was billions upon billions trying to be added to the world's biggest ETFs, and then behind that, there was just very few industry players. So there was this big disconnect there. The other big side, I think, which was very important, was there seemed to be a tipping point, both generationally and economically, in people taking climate seriously. So actually in 2019, 2020, during COVID, I actually quit my job and set up the business.
Very courageous, as always. Daring founders. You've picked a very sort of particular space. I mean, there's a lot of critique on carbon credits being a valid solution towards net zero. So what's your thought on this?
So the way we see it, climate transition is a balance sheet exercise. The first thing that you've just heard about from the two previous panelists was really companies, organizations, countries need to calculate the sources of their emissions. And they're always made from moving and making things. That's just the way in which emissions are combusted. And so diagnosing that, calculating it accurately, and reporting on that, which is really the liability management side of the equation, you continue to see a lot of traction, whether it's legislative or through voluntary action. But on the solution side, you really have three activities. You have reduction, substitution, and the residual. Now, even in the most sort of courageous SBTI type approach, actually only 2 to 5% of your emissions are actively reduced as part of your SBTI target. So 90 to 98% of your emissions are sat there as residual. And that's where the carbon market is supposed to come in. Now, the voluntary carbon market is a means through which you can purchase supposedly a ton of carbon, which you can effectively compensate, offset, whichever language you want to use, an equivalent ton that you've created as a business. Now, the idea is that they should be working in tandem. You both reduce, substitute, and offset. But there are a number of...
Very important, yes.
Yeah, very important. But there are a number of challenges as to how people perceive quality, which has led people to believe that, firstly, people just buy poor quality offsets as an excuse not to do harder decisions. And secondly, they can't trust the actual climate claim to liability and asset match, if you see what I mean.
Exactly. And then there's that's the quality or the additionality are the two, I think, main aspects. How do you... Maybe you can explain a bit more about what BeZero actually does, and maybe also contrast it, because often there's confusion as well in the room, contrast it against what a standard body like Gold Standard or Verra does.
So the way a carbon credit is created, you have a project developer who has an idea or an opportunity, and they're seeking capital to ultimately deliver that idea. And traditionally, a carbon credit is supposed to be for an activity which cannot be financed through any other means other than the carbon revenues associated with the carbon credit.
How do you ensure that, though?
So that's where additionality comes in, exactly. And so there's levels of additionality. So one way would be what proportion of the funding gap is contributed by the carbon credits. That's one way of looking at it. And the other one would be, is there any other funding which could be available, public or private, to actually make that activity happen? So the extreme examples would be, before there would be renewable energy, where there was a certain section that couldn't be funded, and now clearly additionality is weaker except for frontier or developing markets where there's still less capital, versus something like direct air capture, where 100% of the revenues will be generated because of the actual carbon unit that's sold from them.
Yeah, in carbon removal, I think not too much discussion on that front. I think carbon removal credits, we're clear. I think it's probably more, the additionality is mostly in renewable energy projects, questionable.
Well, I think what you find is a big spectrum. What we find in the market is we've rated...
Do you have some numbers on that?
So we've rated about 280 projects. That's about 54% of issuance outstanding. Clearly, you start with the biggest projects. To give you a sense, 50% of the world's credits have been created by 1% of the world's developers. So it's actually quite highly concentrated. And what you find is there are 5, 6, 7 methodology standard bodies, BeZero Gold Standard, the American registries, Plan Vivo, and a few other emerging ones. And they all have their nuances. Now, back to how we differ. In traditional processes, your developer borrows or has money, takes it through an accreditation process. That's stamped, that it passes, and it's just a pass or fail test. And then you can issue credits against the performance, which are sold on to corporates. The challenge, as we see it, is greenwashing or allegations of a lack of quality come about because that information discovery process is not sufficient for the level of money trying to access that space. So coming back to the sort of background in sell-side research, or in fact many people here with their red tags who are investors, the number one thing that people do is ask questions of these things. And if you've not got the architecture to ask these questions, and quality is definitively binary, i.e. it just passes or fails and that's the end of the conversation, you can understand that whenever things go wrong, whenever there's issues, that suddenly everyone tries to bring down the whole house. Whereas actually that's just because of the immaturity of the market, we believe. So the rating is about saying once it's been accredited, which is a pass or fail, what's the distribution? What's our confidence or the probability that it actually delivers a ton according to our research? And the purpose of that is twofold. One, to give an indicator of the quality as opposed by our assessments. But perhaps bigger, it's to open up all the workings to the industry to make their own decisions and use us as a reference point. And that's why we're more of an institutional B2B platform. So our clients are people that have lots of decisions to be making in this space.
Do you have numbers as well that sort of indicate what the efficiency of today's carbon credit projects are versus what's sort of on the label?
Yeah, so it's not a direct discount. So, the probability is high, moderate, or low. Let's just take that as an example. Low, you could say, 30 to 40% probability of hitting it. But unfortunately, you haven't got the default data to actually prove that. Okay. So in 10 years' time, we could have this conversation. I could show you 20 years of default history, and I could prove that statistically. Now it's more about the confidence interval. So the examples would be, in the market, we see what's called a negative skew. So there's a negative distribution. More than a half projects sit in the lowest band of our rating.
More than half?
More than half.
Okay.
Then there's probably about 40%, 35% sit in the moderate, and then about 15% sit in the higher band.
If that would be the bonds market, that would probably... Right.
No, that is actually very similar to the distribution in bond markets.
Okay.
So actually what you see in bond markets is a negative skew in the distribution and a lot more projects with lower quality than are considered high quality.
Okay. Can you sort of give a bit more insights or detail on what are the drivers of quality? What do you do, or what does your product do in terms of assessing the quality of a credit?
So again, the main question is, to what extent do we believe this delivers a ton? There are two things you have to do. Firstly, you have to establish what the carbon project's actually claiming. And so for anyone that's interested, we put out a data template last week, which is effectively years of us sitting around trying to turn 400, 500 pages of development documents into one simple carbon accounting equation, which we've given to the market for free. And that's what I consider to be the null hypothesis. I am a project, I have issued credits, I am claiming that I am doing these actions. This is my baseline, this is my carbon stock, here is how I've calculated my performance. And effectively what we do is we take it apart and we put it back together again. And we say, okay, on each of these assumptions, whether it's how you calculated your baseline, how you modeled your overcrediting, how your leakage belt use is different to other people, we remodel it and we say, okay, well, what's our confidence interval in all of these claims? And that basically sum of the parts gives an indication. And that's all debated at a committee, and the committee will decide the final rating.
Okay. Maybe we're running out of time here. Sort of just quickly give us a hope, give us some sign of hope. Where's this market heading? What's happening? What the trends are? Yeah,
so I think that it's a big thing. Can carbon credits contribute to the path to net zero? There are two things from our side. There's the confidence in the actual claims, so that's basically building the demand side, and there's building the supply side architecture, which is liquidity infrastructure and information infrastructure, i.e. can people access them at scale and invest at scale, and do people have the information to make those decisions accurately? And ultimately, it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, because you kind of need these things to be built and the demand side to be confident in them to justify the building. And what you're seeing at the moment is a lot of speculation that these things will materialize, but that's for us to deliver in the future.
Okay. I hope everybody's smarter on carbon credits now.